Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AACC webinar on gainful employment and eligibility notice of proposed rulemakings, potential impact on community colleges. I'm David Boehm, Senior Vice President of Government Relations at AACC. I'm joined this afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and this morning if you're central or points further west. Good morning to you. I'm joined by Jim Hermes, Associate Vice President for Government Relations at AACC, and Alexis Gravely, who's a Legislative Analyst as part of our team as well. I want to thank you all for taking some time to learn about this very important package of regulations, which will have a great impact on our students and our colleges. The details of these regulations are still pending. This is a notice of proposed rulemaking, not a final regulation. And so our hope coming out of this webinar in an hour from now is that you will have a fundamental understanding of the issues that are in play right now, their significance for our colleges, and what you can do to influence the rulemaking process. I like to mention at the top that this is a very complicated and vast set of regulations. The original printed version was 1,077 pages overall. And despite the fact that AACC, as well as other associations and you, are primarily focused on gainful employment, and that's what we highlighted in our publicity about this webinar, the regulations are not limited only to gainful employment, and we'll talk about some of those other areas in a few minutes. So we will do our best to communicate to you information that is very detailed and very much legalistic in its nature in this oral fashion. Rest assured, we've put the slides for the webinar in the chat so you can access them that way. They will be posted on our website, or maybe are posted on our website already, and we'll send them to you after the webinar. So you don't need necessarily to follow this webinar, point by point, or write things down. You'll get the PowerPoint presentation as described. And some of this discussion and coverage this afternoon is going to diverge a little bit from the slides, because we want to give you a sense of the context of these regulations, why they were conceived the way they were, what we think their impact might be, and to give you, again, a little bit of the broader understanding of what this is all about to the best of our ability. We will give you an opportunity to put questions in the Q&A section of this webinar that we will attempt to answer at the end of this. Time permitting, which it probably won't be permitting, but if we do have a few minutes, you do have your 3/4 at least of the AACC Government Relations team with you today, and we'll try to answer any other questions you might have about the other things we're working on your behalf in Washington, D.C. So let me start off by focusing on gainful employment, and just to remind the many of you who are familiar with a bit of the history of this regulation. Some of you will not be familiar with it, but the gainful employment is not coming at us for the first time in these regulations. Gainful employment regulations were promulgated twice by the Obama administration. First in 2011 after being proposed in 2009 initially. They were later invalidated in court. The Obama administration reconfigured those regulations, responded to the court's ruling, and implemented them a second time. And they did take effect towards the end of the Obama administration. They really were only in effect for 1 full year before the Trump administration took office, which had a very different and negative perspective about the rules. And they basically stopped enforcing them. And then later in the Trump administration, they formally rescinded them, which is an administrative process where the regulations are formally withdrawn. Then when the Biden administration took office, they indicated their interest in getting back into this area. And in the first part of last year, for 3 months, there was a set of institutional programmatic rulemaking sessions that concluded in most key areas without consensus. I won't go into that now, but agreement wasn't reached on gainful employment and other issues, which has allowed the department to move forward in writing the rules as it is proposing to do. At those negotiated rulemaking sessions, AACC and ACCT were represented by our nominees. We had Dr. Ann Kress, the president of Northern Virginia Community College, as our lead negotiator, and Will Durden from the Washington State Community Technical College System also negotiated on our behalf. So our voice was heard in those negotiations, even though they weren't concluded. And then finally, just to provide a little bit of historical context and political context, it's important to note that we are having a presidential election next year, and particularly if the Republicans, Republican candidate wins that election, we would expect, or at least it would certainly not be surprising, were there to be a re-examination of these regulations and possibly another rescinding of them as occurred in the last administration. So a little bit about what is informing the Biden administration's effort in this area. First of all, President Biden is a Democrat. As a general predilection, Democratic administrations tend to be more oriented towards regulating higher education. They certainly were during the Obama administration compared to Donald Trump's administration. And this Department of Education has been extraordinarily active in a variety of ways, including in proposing and in some cases implementing regulations. So we wouldn't be surprised to see ambitious regulatory package such as that's being proposed being advanced. It's also clear that the Biden administration remains focused on the proprietary, the for-profit industry to a large extent in pushing forward these regulations, not exclusively, as we'll describe in a few minutes. The regulations impact all of higher education in some key areas. So this set of rules is not just about for-profits. But having said that, there is by far a disproportionate impact on for-profit institutions through the proposed gainful employment rules. The third bullet on this slide highlights the reality that given the Biden administration's commitment to its policies on canceling student debt and reformulating and making more favorable student repayment policies through income-driven repayment, that there has been a corresponding interest in trying to hold higher education more accountable and making it more transparent and more forward-facing to the public. And some of that too is reflected in these rules and goes well beyond for-profit education. And then finally, for those of you who follow regulatory policy really closely, you will remember that the Department of Education just late last year and into this year proposed what they called a low financial value framework for designating some programs as having low financial value. They solicited input on that. AACC submitted comments that were extremely oppositional to that. We don't think that it's a good idea for the federal government to say that a given set of programs, a subset of programs, is of low financial value. There are technical and policy and signaling aspects to that we did not support. So we asked them not to do that. Having said that, the regulations that are now before you are really a adaptation or variation or permutation of those that initiative, and it's basically been subsumed into what you'll hear about in the next couple minutes. With that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague Alexis to talk about the gainful employment metrics and the calculations that will be used and some of their impact that are a core part of the gainful employment proposed rules. Alexis?
Thank you, David. So at the start, just to be clear, the programs that we're talking about here are your certificate and non-degree programs that are eligible for federal student aid. So this tends to be your more career-oriented programs, such as cosmetology, culinary arts, things like that. And essentially, the department is measuring the outcomes of these programs to see how students fare after they completed them. And they have two metrics in which they're going to be doing this. The first is the debt to earnings metrics. These may sound familiar. They were a part of the 2014 regulations, and there are two components. The annual debt to earnings is measuring how much of a student's loan payment is compared to their annual earnings. And the discretionary DE rate is the same, students' annual loan payment compared to their discretionary earnings. Those discretionary earnings, they're defined as the median earnings minus 150% of a given year's federal poverty guideline. So a program would fail the debt to earnings metrics if both the annual DE rate and the discretionary DE rate are above a certain percentage. For the annual rate, that's 8%, and for the discretionary rate, that's 20%. And if it isn't possible to calculate the DE rates for a particular year, whether that's because there are limitations in data or there aren't enough students in the program to calculate the rates, then the program retains the same status as it had in the previous year. Next slide. The second metric, this is new. It was not a part of the 2014 regulations, and this is the earnings premium. And what the department is trying to get at with this is determining whether students who have completed a program are making more than a high school graduate upon completion. I emphasize that these metrics apply to people who complete the program. So if you have students who started and then drop out, they are not a part of the calculations the department will be doing. So for this earnings premium, it compares the median annual earnings of completers to a threshold. The threshold is going to vary from state to state because it's based on the median annual earnings for an adult ages 25 to 34 with only a high school diploma in the state where the college is, or if there are fewer than 50% of students who are in the program in the state where the college is, then they'll look at the national threshold, which is about $25,000. And so we're comparing students about 3 years after they've completed the program. And if this data isn't available, they'll get the earnings from a federal agency who has earnings data. So that could be the IRS, for example. Then the program again will retain the same status as the previous award here. Next slide. So if a program fails one of these metrics or both of these metrics in a single year, so if they fail the DE rates both in 1 year or the earnings premium in 1 year, or both, then they will have to provide a warning to students that the program could be at risk of losing federal eligibility. The department wants to make sure that students see that warning. So students will have to acknowledge that they've seen it before they can receive Title IV aid to participate in the program. If a program fails the same measure for 2 out of 3 consecutive years, that's when it loses its Title IV eligibility. So for example, if a program fails the earnings premium in the first year, maybe doesn't in the second year for some reason, but then fails it again in the third year, it would lose that Title IV eligibility. 3 years must pass after that point before a program can seek to become eligible for Title IV aid again. And the previous regulations had a fairly extensive appeals process. This time around, the department has proposed that institutions can only appeal a decision that terminates a program if Ed has miscalculated one of their rates, and that's what led to the eligibility termination action. So as a part of its NPRM, the department provided some calculations and some outcomes that they predict of how these regulations would affect various sectors of higher education. Most community colleges don't have programs that would fail either the debt to earnings or the earnings premium metric. As you can see, over 90% of community colleges don't have any enrollment in programs that would fail the metrics. This is largely because metrics can't be calculated for most programs. We'll get into this a little bit later, but there have to be 30 completers over either a 2-year or 4-year period for the metrics to be calculated, and some programs just aren't large enough for that. So there are only 4.8% of undergraduate certificate programs that have enough students to produce the rates, but I want to emphasize that that number encompasses 21% of students that are enrolled in GE undergraduate certificate programs at public institutions. So Ed's goal here is not to capture the greatest number of programs and measure, how their outcomes are. It's rather to catch the greatest number of enrollment in the programs, the greatest number of students who would be impacted. So across the 4,100 GE programs, all sectors of higher education that can have metrics calculated, there are 65% of students enrolled in those programs. As David mentioned, the for-profit institutions are largely the ones that would be impacted by these metrics. As you can see in the second bullet point, close to 1,500 programs that the for-profits would fail at least one of the rates. But still, there are public and private nonprofit institutions in which either one of the rates, they would fail one of the rates. So there are about 700,000 students across sectors who are currently in failing gainful employment programs. And those are the students that the department is really focused on. Of the programs that fail one of the two tests, most of them fail the earnings premium. So that means that the students are not making more than a high school graduate in the age range that the department has provided.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexis, for outlining the metrics and some of their impact. I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about the administrative side of implementing these regulations. For those of you who were involved in implementation of the earlier iterations of gainful employment that we referred to earlier, you will be well aware of the extraordinary cost and time that needed to be invested to comply with the gainful employment rules. And as your National Association representatives, you should be reassured that we are acutely conscious of that fact and will do everything that we can. We'll describe this in greater detail in a minute, to try to ensure that whatever regulatory structure ultimately is applied here minimizes institutional burden. This next slide outlines some of Ed's estimates about the time that it would take to implement the rule, the cost on institutions for 2-year public colleges. Frankly, we would not bet everything that we had on these estimates. They are consistently, notoriously underestimates. And again, we know from previous experience in generating the data for gainful employment, that the time needed can be extraordinary. We do not have a sectoral number about the cost of implementing the 2014 regulations, but a number of institutions told us that it involved hundreds of thousands of dollars for them in terms of personnel as well as software that needed to be purchased in order to implement the rules. So just know that we do have your backs on this, and we've already communicated this in a variety of ways to the department, starting well before these current regulations. The next area that we're going to talk about is financial value transparency, or what the department is calling it. And in some respects, this framework the department is creating is, to my way of thinking, the single most important aspect in these very far-reaching regulations. And the reason why is that, as I'll describe in a minute, the department is putting together a template, a framework that will surface and display data on each and every higher education program that is eligible for Title IV aid along a variety of variables. These variables do track the gainful employment metrics that Alexis just described to you, and also include other information. But essentially what the department is doing is extending the eligibility, that is the ability to qualify for Title IV, those criteria to all higher education programs, whether it's a four-year liberal arts program, whether it's a community college program, whether it's a graduate program. And they want the public to see, consumers to know how previous students have fared in terms of completion, the debt that they've taken on, the repayment rates that they have had, some other demographic information about the program. So this is a major change in higher education policy. Most of you will know that this is echoes the college scorecard, and it does build on the college scorecard and is similar to it, but it's more expansive. It includes more variables and more programs. And so this is a really big change in higher ed policy that we know all of higher education is looking at, and looking at closely, some sectors quite warily. Next slide, please. So the way the department is going to create this new public information mechanism is to have what they're calling a disclosure website that will have on it each and every program that's eligible for Title IV included, with a variety of data such as they are made available. Colleges will be required to make the website, and this will be a Department of Education run website, available to students and the public on all the normal public facing modes of communication that the colleges use. So basically a variety of communications, just like colleges are now required to put their Title IX references on their website. This will be similar to that. The key thing in terms of policy is that relating to debt to earnings is that for non-GE programs, so that's, let's just say your liberal arts program in literature, that if that program, according to the department's calculations, fails to meet the debt to earnings standard that Alexis just described to you, students will be informed about that fact and be required to be informed about that fact by the institution, and will have to acknowledge that. And the acknowledgement will be made not to the institution, but through the department's website. So there's no skirting it. There's no way that administrative snafu or whatever would get around this. Not that anybody would want to do that, but this will be a centralized mechanism that will include, again, all higher education programs. So this is to put in the vernacular, a really big deal. And we're interested to see how it will all play out. Next slide, please. So where do our institutions come in terms of providing the data that will make GE and this disclosure website run? As with the previous gainful employment regulations, but now extended in some respects to all programs, colleges will have to provide a variety of programmatic data about the students enrolled in those programs. And the primary reason to do this is so that these metrics that Alexis just described can be generated. It is of some comfort that the metrics themselves will be calculated by the Department of Education. This is not an institutional responsibility. Our college's responsibility will be to send information about the students who enrolled, information about their debt, information about when they enrolled and when they completed, and so forth. And an important component of this for the GE programs, and keep in mind there's a GE side to this and a non-GE side to this. Obviously, the non-GE side involves more students, vastly more students. For the GE side of these calculations, only students who receive Title IV aid will be included. So metrics will only involve those students. So that is an important subset of all the potential students who would be included in the GE metrics. The same thing applies for, without the same eligibility implications for students in the non-GE programs. For GE, the colleges will have to provide information looking back as much as 7 years for each of these programs that I described that these metrics would be calculated on. So, and we know from experience that was a huge effort entailed on the part of institutions. We've pointed that out to the department. They're going to use that data to generate the cohorts that will lead to the calculation of the GE rates. And that's what they're proposing. And my expectation is that that's probably what they'll stick with. And their hope is that because colleges have implemented this in very similar form previously, that it will not be as burdensome as it was last time through. The other thing that we have pointed out to the department is that we want to make sure that every bit of data department or its contractors currently possesses that will be used for these data to be generated and this disclosure website to be created, that the department's data be used rather than institutions and colleges not be required to submit something twice or submit something the department already has. Finally, Jim, just an important thing, this is all probably getting somewhat confusing to you all. We will answer questions in just a moment, but there's a 7-year look back for programs, for the students in programs that are GE programs. For non-GE programs, colleges can just, so it's all the other ones, can just submit data for the last 2 years. That's the last bullet on this slide, which is of course a much more limited regulatory requirement. But even though there won't be the same quality of data provided as would be through a longer look back, the metrics will still be calculated. And then I don't want to get too far into this. This is some of the mechanics of how these gainful employment rates will be calculated. Some of you will be familiar with this though, but basically the department has to hit a number of 30 in order to enable adequate wage matching and and personal information being shielded. So they need 30 people in order to do that. If they can't get it from a 2-year look back, they do it through a 4-year look back. Of course, when you go back 4 years, that's getting a fair time in the past, and there may be some data quality issues associated with that, but that's the framework that they have that they are using. And of course, the data to generate in the 4-year look back, it's years 3 through 6, so it's quite a bit previous to the current what's going on currently in the program. Okay, so Finally, what do we make of all this? Well, there are some good things. There are some less good things. First of all, know that we will be, as your association, submitting comments on these regulations that are due a week from Tuesday, June 20th. In a minute, we'll talk about what you can do if you're interested in submitting comments. Here's some general positions that AACC has taken over time and what we expect our comments to reflect. First, we think that overall, transparency for all programs, particularly the generation of wage data, which is so important to our institutions, is a plus. With all the data shortcomings that may ensue from having a lot of small programs, and Alexis described the fact that more than a third of programs won't have DE and earnings premiums rates calculated. We think that overall, these program data are a good thing so long as institutional burdens associated with them are absolutely minimized. Secondly, we have long supported using debt to earnings metrics as a way of evaluating program, not so much program quality, but as justifying federal support. Community colleges, as you all know, were about low tuitions, minimal borrowing, making it easier than in other sectors of higher education for students to access and succeed in higher education without undue financial obligation. And so debt to earnings is an approach and a metric, a philosophy that AACC supports. AACC has not supported the earnings premium that Alexis described. It's a fixed standard that applies across an entire state. Therefore, as the department itself acknowledged in its preamble to the rules, it will apply differently and impact differently different parts of the state. Certainly urban areas, earnings are going to be higher on average than in rural areas, all other things being equal. There are also the reality that there are differences in labor markets for various populations. And so people in some of those groups that don't fare as well in the labor market, that are disproportionately enrolled in certain programs, might find those programs becoming ineligible because the earnings for those are lower. So we're opposing the earnings premium. We think we have some good arguments for it that will be in our comments. Department at the same time seems very committed to this. And finally, as I've described, we are again quite conscious of the cost of implementing these regulations and are working with the department in every way we can to make sure that that's minimized. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and glad to be with you, everyone. Before I get started on the next set of regulations, just a reminder to please type in your questions as they occur to you into the Q&A box on your dashboard. We hope to leave some time to get to those questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the one of the other major facets of this regulatory package outside of the gainful employment regulations per se, although there's a lot of interplay between various parts of this regulatory package. In this area is the certification procedures. There are a number of changes that the department has made in the procedures and the requirements that institutions must comply with in order to be certified at the institutional programmatic level by the Department of Education. So to start off with probably the biggest one of them all, the regulations would add a new set of supplemental performance measures into the certification procedures. Basically, as it says here, the secretary would assume new authority, and to our mind, it is very broad and it's very vague authority. As you can see here, there are a number of things that the secretary may consider in determining whether to certify an institution. It doesn't say that the secretary has to. It doesn't say that they have to do all these measures or some of them, and it's not even really necessarily limited to the specific things that you see here on the slide, but these include the withdrawal rates, debt to earnings, a number of the things, as I said a minute ago, in terms of the interplay. Here we have debt to earnings rates coming back in a much vaguer way than they are in the gainful employment regulation, where you do have a metric and you have a percentage, and if you're above that percentage, then you are failing. You fail on that metric. But here, debt to earnings rates will be considered in a unspecified way by the secretary, and as well as the earnings premium, to potentially deny an institution certification. Another aspect of the certification procedures in this regulation regards the program length that is allowed for specifically for gainful employment programs. And within that group of programs, we're talking about here programs that lead to licensure and state certifications. In other words, programs that have, by and large, a state imposed minimum number of hours that a student must receive in order to be able to get that license. Those programs, essentially. The department, in negotiated rulemaking on this topic, and now continuing with the NPRM, has showed a great deal of concern about programs in this area being too long, as with vis-a-vis these state-imposed minimum requirements. So right now, a program can be 150% of that state requirement, and the proposed regulation would basically eliminate that wiggle room that institutions have now, and saying that a program is limited in length to the greater of the minimum length of a program that's required by the state in which the institution is located. And that's going to be for our institutions, that's going to be the part of it that applies, really most of the time. However, if most of the students in a given program are in another state, then it will be that state. If that state's minimum requirement is longer, then that state's requirement would apply, and the program could then be that long. This is actually an improvement over what the department put on the table during negotiated rulemaking. And not to get into that in any great detail, but basically what they put forward at that point in time would have potentially limited aid eligibility for students in some of our programs to shorter amount of time than the program that they are actually enrolled in. So that shouldn't occur here. But again, as I mentioned, we do lose that wiggle room that is in current regulation in terms of what the allowed program length is for these programs. Again, also in the area of this, programs that lead to licensure and state certification, there are new requirements in terms of what the institution must do to ensure that their program meets the requirements of states where students come to them from. So really, largely this is going to be playing out in the online context, but of course, you may have situations where you have students from other states, particularly, institutions in border areas and so forth. So the regulation would require the institution to determine for each state in which students in the programs are located, whether a program meets these, satisfies these requirements. So it's this multi-state aspect to this that is new. The department, despite the strenuous comments during negotiating rulemaking, and what they will surely hear again in terms of comments in the current proceeding, and that argument is that it is not easy for institutions to go to states and determine what their requirements are and whether their program meets that requirements. There's just states vary a lot in terms of how simple that will be, in terms of whether they even have published requirements for certain occupations and licenses, and if they don't, whether they be willing to tell an institution whether their program meets their requirements. There's a lot of complexity here, and so this, if this in fact comes to be in a final regulation, this will put forth a lot of complexity for your programs in which students enroll from multiple states. And then in another area of the regulations regarding the requirements that institutions must comply with to show that they are capable of administering the Title IV program, there are a number of additional either new requirements or bolstering of present requirements in this area. These first two in this slide are essentially more detailed requirements in areas where there already are requirements. There are more elaborate financial aid counseling requirements. As you can see here, it's going beyond the basic idea of making sure students are aware of what different types of aids are, whether what not it's something that needs to be repaid or doesn't need to be repaid, that sort of basic information. But to this requirement now that communications have to advise students and families to accept the most beneficial types of financial assistance available to them. So I'm much more kind of, it says an activist requirement for institutions in that area. There's also more beefy requirements in the areas of cohort default rates and determining validity of high school diplomas. The one that we've been really focused on in this area is a new requirement that institutions provide adequate career services. This is not something that's mentioned in the statute. We don't think it really has anything to do with an institution showing that they are administratively capable of administering the Title IV program at their campuses. But nonetheless, this is something that's in the regulations. And as you can see here, there are a number of different factors that would determine whether or not an institution is providing adequate career services. And we're focused a lot on this first one, which is the share of an institution's students enrolled in GE programs, which basically implies that the more GE programs that you have, the greater capacity and greater level of career services that you need to have at your institution. We think this is wrong-headed for a couple of different reasons, but primarily this notion that kind of permeates a lot of these regulations, that students in other programs that aren't GE programs, that their main aim also is not to get a job after they graduate from that program. That's certainly the aim of students in any number of different types of programs, not just GE. So we don't think that there should be we don't think that this requirement should exist at all in terms of career services, but certainly it shouldn't be based in part on how much you have in terms of gainful employment programs on your campuses. And then another related requirement is that for those programs that include clinicals, like for instance, nursing programs and other programs that would fit under the the GE definition, those programs have to have geographically accessible clinical or externship opportunities where those things are required to complete the program. Those have to be available within 45 days of completion of the coursework. This will probably not be a major imposition on our colleges and our programs. This usually plays out more in the sense that you are limiting enrollment in your programs in the first place because you will have trouble finding more clinical spots, for instance, in a program. So you're not going beyond in terms of enrollment and finding those spots for those people, but nonetheless, this is a requirement to be aware of. And then finally, in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, this is the contents of the disclosure website that I believe both Alexis and David mentioned, because requirements in the areas that they talked about in the gainful employment regulations refer, as you heard, to this website. But here is what we anticipate will be the contents of that website. You can see it's a long list, and you can see also that it is not. We don't know for sure that this is what will be required to be on the website. It's essentially up to the department to determine exactly what they want on that website, but they do list all these factors as things that may be included. So I think you can probably take from that fact that they've listed that in the proposed regulation, that these are things that are likely to be required on that website. A lot of the calculations that will be made by the department, but as David and Alexis detailed earlier, This, of course, will require a lot of reporting of information on the institution's part. And not only do we not know that everything on this list will necessarily be on the website, but it could also be the fact that things not on this list may wind up being as a required element for this disclosure website. So I'm going to turn it back over to David now, and he's going to talk a little bit about how you can get involved in this process, and we hope you do.
Thank you, Jim. So we've concluded our overview of these regulations. And as you just heard, they're a lot broader than just gainful employment. What can you do to affect these rules? That's the primary reason why we're sponsoring this webinar. Comments are due soon, but they're not due until a week from Tuesday. On this slide, you can link to the formal notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, which includes the instructions for submitting comments. I would say in all earnestness, the Department of Education is supportive of our colleges and is sensitive to the administrative issues that we've described in implementation, particularly of gainful employment, but other related reporting. So anything that you could do to communicate your perspectives on these proposed rules would be helpful to our efforts. Got some examples of things that you might want to comment upon in the rules, but as you just heard, they're extremely broad. You might have an issue about the length of your program being longer than the minimum the state, requires. You might have a default rate that's been high, and the department is examining default rates somewhat more aggressively than previously, not the number, but just the way that they're being incorporated into the program participation agreement. You might have particular concerns about data reporting. So any one of those topics and a myriad of other ones are things that you could comment upon. You certainly don't need to feel obligated to talk about every issue that we talked about today that will be included in AACC's comments or otherwise. And I should say that we also will be joining with the American Council on Education in all likelihood in comments that they will submit, but we will be submitting detailed comments as well on the part of our sector. And of course, we're here to help you answer any questions you might have coming out of this webinar. If you have a chance to examine the regs and you want to make your own college's views be heard. Again, the department will pay attention to what AACC and our member colleges have to say about this. And this is simply quickly just a look at the calendar of regulatory implementation of this package. Comments are due again on the 20th. The department needs to finalize the rules by November 1 of this year under the Higher Education Act, what they call the master calendar, in order for them to take effect on July 1 as described. The reporting that we described, the programmatic reporting, and other information about students and programs in the financial value transparency framework and gainful employment. Those would need to be submitted by July 31st. Obviously, colleges would want to get a head start on that process as soon as the regulation is finalized, if it is finalized. And then finally, after this the initial reporting period of next July 31st, the assumption is that it would be October 1 would be the reporting deadline.
Okay. Despite our, our hope here that everything is crystal clear to you, we do have some questions actually, and they're kind of all really in the same area. And that is this area that we've been mentioned in several different places of how these regulations affect institutions and programs when they have students in their gainful employment and other programs, particularly those licensure programs that are from out of state. So starting with the first one, the question is, could you clarify any implications for community colleges providing distance learning to out-of-state students? For instance, median annual earnings when you are serving students across the country?
The debt to earnings and the earnings premiums would apply to students out of state, but unless more than half of the students were enrolled out of the state, the states the state in which the institution is physically located would be the one that would attach for the purposes of meeting the debt to earnings metrics. There is, because there are some places where students tend to get hired outside of the state that the college is located, that they provided in the regulations the opportunity for institutions to say our students, or more than half of them who complete a program, are out of state.
Yeah, I would just add that, that kind of the concept of more than half of students being outside of a state in a given outside of the state where the institution is located in a given program, that concept goes into a lot of areas in terms of what exact requirement the program or institution is required to meet. So the next question, again, in this area, as I mentioned, for licensure requirements in colleges offering distance learning to out-of-state students, how does a college comply when the state where the college is located has a licensing board, but in other states, no licensing board exists or a higher degree, like a master's or a doctorate is required? And I'll just address that first, because this is one of the areas that I talked about in, when I was talking about the incredible complexity that institutions will be faced with. And this question gets right at the heart of that matter. States are far from uniform in terms of information available about their requirements for licensure in certain occupations. So it's not going to be easy at all, at least at the outset, for institutions to go to other states and try to find out, whether their program meets that state's requirements. But of course, if you know that a higher degree is required in that other state, that your program isn't going to meet that requirement. But in many other cases, your institution is going to be in the dark. And one thing we didn't really get into in our presentation is that we have a bit of a conflict between two different requirements within the regulations. So with the one that I talked about, an institution is required to know that for every state where the students are coming from, that their program meets that state's requirements. But in another part of the regulations, they do have essentially a rewording of the current regulation that basically says that an institution is responsible for making it known that they know that their program meets the requirements in states X, Y, and Z. They know it doesn't in 1, 2, and 3, and they don't know in other states. They change that around a little bit, but the net impact is the same. You're going to have basically states that states you for sure know that you don't meet the requirements, and then a whole bunch of states probably where you don't know. That's certainly in conflict with this other requirement where you are required to know for every state, that students are coming to you from. I mean, obviously, the other alternative there is that if you don't know and you can't really find out, then under this regulation, you might not be able to actually enroll that student from that particular state. So the one question in the data area then. So what is the plan for getting actual employment data that is at the employment and earnings data that's at the basis of so many of these requirements?
I'll take a stab at that. I know Alexis is familiar with this as well. The regulations go into this in some detail. The department has said that it will access federal databases from the Department of Treasury to generate, and other agencies to generate the earnings data. And they will do matches with the Social Security numbers of students that are made available to institutions via the Title IV system. And that's really how the scorecard data is currently being generated. That's how the gainful employment metrics previously were generated. That's why the earnings are skewed for community colleges in particular, because fewer than 50% of our students take out Title IV aid, so earnings for a given program on average are going to be, less than half of the students. But essentially, the department is not saying there will be one single entity or organization within the executive branch that will be used. They'll use whichever one they is most efficacious. There are only a few of them that do have this data, though.
And next question, and this is a good one. Will institutions still be required to report gainful employment information if the student is simultaneously enrolled in a certificate program and its mother AA degree program? I'll kick it over to either David or Alexis for that one.
This is a really difficult question, Vicki, because it's one that we've raised before with the department, because we know that there are students who are enrolled in degree programs who ultimately receive a certificate. That is one of the factors that made this generation and reporting of data department complicated, because a student may have initially enrolled, again, in the degree program, not attained the degree, gotten a certificate, but was not included in the gainful employment cohorts or tracked and considered as a gainful employment student really until they got the credential that they did. I think the answer, I can't answer that question definitively. I'm not positive the answer. It's not spelled out in the regulations. I'll note that the department, my colleague, former colleague JJ will know well that the department issued over 100 Dear Colleague letters in implementing these regulations in 2014. We know that students are sometimes declared in two programs, but I can't definitively answer that question at this point in time, with apologies.
Another really good question for the premium earnings metric. What's the likelihood that the Department of Education will make adjustments for colleges serving counties and communities that are rural and historically low income?
We didn't go into that in the presentation. That will be, though, in all likelihood. Our Dr. Bumpus, of course, our CEO, is involved in the final comments that we submit. But in all likelihood, our expectation is that we will ask the department to reflect the point that you're making there, that there be some accommodation for low-income counties in the calculation of the earnings premium. So we are thinking along those lines. That, as I mentioned, the department is aware that there are tremendous regional variations within a state about average incomes, and so we're hopeful that we can come up with something that will be acceptable to them.
And then finally, in terms of what the questions we have before us now, and this is getting back to that area of licensure programs and distance education students or students from out of state in any case, is there any consideration of a student waiver or reciprocity on licensure requirements? So for example, most states have a state constitution, state history requirement in teacher preparation programs. The student could be licensed in the state where the college is located and then reciprocate to their home state. As of now, there is not such a provision in the regulations. That was something that was strenuously argued for by some negotiators during the negotiated rulemaking proceeding, not only in that area that you mentioned, but also in any number of other areas where basically for whatever reason, the student is fully aware that a given program in a state other than theirs doesn't meet the requirements for the state that they're in, and they want to take that program anyway. There is not a method by which they can waive out, as you mentioned in your question, out of those requirements for the institution. So that will certainly be, we know that will be the focus of comments in the NPRM proceedings. So we'll have to see whether the department makes any changes, but that is something that they have not provided for to date. And then we have time for this one last question. How do we think the department will evaluate the high school only earnings data, since it ranges 24 to 35 years of age, since many of those students could have been increasing earnings over the 15 years in the same career post high school. Another really great question. I'll give that to David.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It is a great question. The department has said for the for-profit colleges that the average certificate grantee or recipient is 27 years old. We think that however, that said, the median age of a community college student now, according to NIPSAS, is 23 years of age, not the mean, the median. And we think that your point is extremely well taken. The department is aware of the general line of argumentation. I don't think it's particularly likely that they're going to say that the 25 to 34-year-old window is illegitimate on that basis. We did raise this issue in negotiated rulemaking. Our negotiator, Dr. Kress, did. Originally, the department wanted to just use high school graduates altogether, so they could have been 65 years old, for example, up to retirement, traditional retirement age. And they're pretty bought into this, and they're very much bought into the earnings premium standard. And so we will raise this point, but we're not particularly optimistic about it, but we certainly would encourage you to do so in comments that you might make. We are at time now. We can answer any questions offline. I do, before we go, want to thank my co-presenters, Alexis and Jim. Want to thank Dr. Parham, Martha Parham, for her support, and Amy Bortmas for her ongoing support of this webinar. We do want to advertise our universally highly evaluated program in Washington in September, Advocates in Action, that we'll be doing again on September 18 and 19. And please just keep in touch with us. And if you have any further questions by way of follow-up, we're here to answer them for you. And we encourage you, urge you to make your views on these regulations to the extent that you can known to the department. Thanks everyone for being with us today. Thank you.